Tom, given the breadth and the complexity of what you're doing and drawing together so many threads and interacting with so many dialogue partners, how would you say that this book, Paul and the Faithfulness of God, how does it open up new vistas or new conversations in Pauline studies?
Yeah, one of the main conversations that always goes on with Paul is how do we place him in relation to first century Judaism, to the Jewish world of his day? Is he basically a Jewish thinker who happens to believe that the Messiah has come but without too much else changing? Or has he transformed something, the early movement of Christianity, from a basically Jewish movement into something totally different? And what I've tried to do in exploring the Jewish world of Paul's day, which I've done at some length in chapter 2 of this book, is to set the context then for saying here are some quite new ways in for understanding, particularly the central thing, Paul's vision of God. One of the things which I've enjoyed exploring over the last 10 years or so is the way in which many Second Temple Jews really didn't believe that their God had ever properly returned to the temple as he'd said he would. In Isaiah 40 to 55, in Malachi 3, in the prophet Zechariah, in some of the Psalms as well. They celebrate the fact that Yahweh, Israel's God, is going to come back, is going to defeat evil, is going to establish his glory in the temple once more. And we sort of know what they thought that might look like, because at the end of the book of Exodus, with the construction of the tabernacle, in 1 Kings 8, when Solomon builds the temple, and one or two other points, we have this idea of here is the temple, and the glory of the Lord comes into the house, and the house is filled with smoke and glory and light and a sense of presence, and everyone falls on their faces, and this is just amazing. And then we read the Second Temple literature, and despite the fact that Isaiah said the glory of the Lord will be revealed and all flesh will see it together, we scratch our heads and say, it doesn't actually seem to have happened. And then we realize that in the New Testament they're saying it has happened, but it didn't look like that. It looked like Jesus, and it looked like the Spirit. And actually the book of Acts is about that, if we had eyes to see. But to stick with Paul, when Paul talks about the church as the temple of the living God, Paul is a first century Jew who knows that the temple is the place which God said he would come to and live in and reveal his glory in. So when he talks about the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, this is temple language. So one of the lines of thought which I hope others will pick up and develop is that so much of Paul's vision of Jesus and of the Spirit is rooted in the ancient Jewish hope that God would come back at last, would make his glory known, and would thereby transform the world. Romans 8, for instance, one of the most famous chapters in all of Paul, is not normally read in this way, and I think it should be. And I think, therefore, for instance, that whereas some people have said, well, the early Christians had a high view of Jesus, but it took them 3 or 4 centuries to have an equally high view of the Spirit. Well, yes, the early fathers did take a while to catch up. But when Paul is talking about the Spirit in passages like 2 Corinthians 3 and 4, in passages like Romans 8, in a verse like Galatians 4, 6 following, what he's saying about the Spirit is itself rooted in the idea of the return of Yahweh to Zion. You cannot have a higher view of the Spirit than that. So I would hope at the level of, if you like, in the abstract terms, the doctrine of God, what we say about what Paul says about the God of Israel, then we would see that in Jesus and the Spirit, he is saying some absolutely stunning things, which most Pauline theologians, I think, have not even begun to glimpse. And when we see that, then all sorts of other vistas open up in those other areas of what Paul says about the people of God, that the people of God in Christ, is it the new Israel? Is it the true Israel? Is it something quite different? Paul was struggling to say what had to be said there. We've got all sorts of political sensitivities about saying any of that because of the great 20th century problems about the persecution of the Jews, etc. But we have to, in a sense, we've got to be sensitive to that, but we have to set it aside to the extent of saying, let's track with what Paul is doing and see if we can find appropriate ways of saying that. And I hope that I have tried to map that out a bit. And then when we talk about the ultimate future, one of the great things is that so many Christians still assume that the name of the game for the ultimate future is simply to go to heaven when you die. And for Paul, there's no question we're talking about a whole new creation. The whole world for Paul is now God's holy land, and for Paul, God the Creator is going to renew the whole of creation. Again, that's what Romans 8 is all about, also 1 Corinthians 15. And it seems to me that many Christians need to get inside that hope, understand how and why that's the hope that Paul set out. So in the area of God, God's people, God's future. In each of these areas, I hope I have set out things which will be opportunities for others to take these further and to explore more fully.